For those of you who are just joining us, there are still more joining us. So I want to let you know we'll be starting in just a few minutes, and thank you for your patience. I can see people are joining us now. Welcome. There are more to come, so please just hang on a few minutes and we'll get started. I know some of you have been patiently waiting in the waiting room. There are still more people getting into the room. I haven't quite figured it out. It seems like electronically we might have a wider door, but apparently you're still coming in one at a time. Thank you for your patience. All right, we've got the cue that it's time to go. I want to thank everyone for joining us here for this event. I'm Victoria Jones. I'm the Chief Global Affairs Officer at the University of California, Irvine. And UCI is committed to international education, to understanding the world, to bringing the world to our community and being sure that we're all connected and understanding the best we can what is happening today. So we've had an opportunity, an interesting opportunity this year to think about elections. And the US elections have become challenged, and people are questioning, could they possibly be rigged? Is the system broken? Or is it actually dependable? And so we thought it would be a great time to explore the US election system, but in a comparative way. How does the US election system compare to other countries, and countries that share some characteristics with the United States in terms of democracy and broad participation, et cetera. So we have with us today 3 law professors and from 3 different countries who will be sharing their perspectives, both on their country and then also on electoral systems in a more philosophical way about what's ideal and what really works. So we're starting with Rick Hasen, and he's our professor here at UC Irvine. And Yasmin Dawood, she's from the University of Toronto, and Graeme from the University of Queensland. So Australia, Canada, and the US. And if you have questions, you can send them in the Q&A. We'll be getting to questions in the last section of this event. And in the meantime, I'm going to kick it off to Rick to get us started. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Victoria, and thanks to the Center for arranging this program. I think it's important, especially assuming that most of the people who are watching this broadcast are United States citizens or residents, to get a comparative perspective, because we're spending so much time right now talking about whether our elections are going to be successful, whether we're going to have some kind of meltdown, whether it might take weeks to get results. That I think it's useful to hear from other people who know about other advanced democracies and how they run their elections, and how the United States in many ways is unique, and I would say somewhat behind in terms of thinking about how elections are administered. So I really appreciate this opportunity, especially to be joined by Yasmin and Graeme, who are leading international experts in election law. And we're really fortunate that they've been able to come to UCI and share some of their time with us. One of the disadvantages of Zoom is that we can't all be together, but if we were trying to do this in person, I doubt we could get either Yasmin or Graeme to come as far as California for an event like this. So this really is, I think, the only way we could do this kind of event. So I wanted to start off by talking about the controversies over mail-in balloting. And let me just set the stage for a bit by describing what's going on in the United States right now in terms of mail-in ballots. and then turn to Graeme and then Yasmin. I think Graeme can speak to both the Australian and the UK experience in terms of mail-in ballots, and Yasmin on the Canadian experience. And as you mentioned, Yasmin is also an expert in comparing the United States and Canada. So interested in hearing from both of you on your perspectives on the United States as well. So we're now about to conduct our national election coming up in early November in the United States. And rather than conduct a single national election for president, we're actually conducting something like 10,500 simultaneous elections, because we give our power to run our elections to county level or sub-county level bodies, and the rules are different everywhere. And so speaking specifically to the question of whether or not you can vote by mail, whether you can vote by mail, how vote by mail works, is something that is a creature of state and local law, and not really one of federal law in the United States. And we've had kind of two kinds of issues that have come up related to the expanded use of mail-in balloting in the United States, given the pandemic. The first issue is that President Trump and some others have raised questions about fraud in the process. Are absentee ballots subject to a lot of fraud? And what the experience that we've seen in the United States is that voter fraud generally, election crimes generally, are quite rare in the United States. When they do happen, they're somewhat more likely to happen with absentee ballots, with mail-in ballots, because they're out of the control of election officials for some point in time. But there are very few cases, and if you look at the 5 states in the United States that conduct almost exclusively mail-in balloting elections, that would be Colorado, Washington, Utah, Hawaii, and Oregon, you see very little rates, very low rates of fraud. It might be different this time because we have many more people in many more states voting by mail, but so far the amount of fraud in the primary season related to absentee ballots also seems to be quite low. But the other issue that we have is one about administrative competence. There was just a story today in the Philadelphia Inquirer about a recent court ruling from the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, which was deciding whether or not voters in Pennsylvania, who when they put in their mail-in ballot, forget to use an inner envelope, so-called secrecy envelope, to ensure that you have a secret ballot. Those voters who mail in those ballots, so-called naked ballots, the ballots are not protected by the secrecy envelope, those voters' ballots will not count. Absent some other court ruling, those ballots will not count. And there is talk that up to 100,000 voters in Pennsylvania might vote and not have their votes counted. And not in every state you get a chance to redo your ballot if you make a mistake. And so a big risk that's coming with the extensive use of mail-in balloting during this pandemic, especially for new voters in the United States, voters who haven't voted before by mail or don't have a lot of experience, is they might be inadvertently disenfranchised because they might not follow all the rules. Some of those rules make a lot of sense, like you have to sign your ballot, not your inner ballot, but the outer ballot. Some of the rules make less sense. I believe in New York, if you try to seal your inner ballot with a piece of tape, rather than just lick it, the envelope closed, your ballot will be tossed. And so we have a kind of arcane set of rules that are not universal, that apply only in some places. And we have courts getting involved in deciding what ballots are going to count, when they're going to count. And so it really is kind of a hodgepodge, kind of a mess in terms of how we deal with mail-in balloting. It doesn't have to be this way. And so let me turn it to Graeme first and then to Yasmin to talk about just comparatively what's going on with mail-in ballots in other advanced democracies. Graeme?
So thanks, Rick. It's curious because for a century or more, we've had postal voting in Australia, and it's been very common for a century in every country, whether it's geographically dispersed or where people are mobile overseas. It was the traditional go-to for early or so-called convenience voting. And for a century, no one really questioned it other than questions of secrecy. So if you're in a subordinate relationship, there was always the question of whether your overbearing partner, carer, or parents might use the ballot for you. And the other question that we were talking about 10 years ago was, look, if we move towards too much early voting and convenience or postal voting, what's going to happen to the ritual election day and campaigning? But as you said, the two issues that are really swamping the United States at the moment are questions about alleged possibility of fraud. And the other one, which I think is probably more significant reality, as you said, is logistical snarls. So if we talked in Australia about logistical snarls, our postal system is pretty robust despite a long-term decline. We recently held an all-male referendum on marriage equality. Everyone in Australia got a ballot on the issue. It wasn't compulsory because it was just a social issue. We had 80% turnout, and I think the only allegation of problems were that some young people might have gone round just for fun and taken some ballots out of letterboxes and thrown them in a local park. But to allow for that, there was barcodes on the ballots, and any elector could recall their ballot at any time or say, I didn't receive it, and then they would be issued a fresh one. The other thing we do, which I don't think happens at most parts of the world, is we allow 10 days for postal ballots to come in. So even if there are problems in the post and it's very slow, every postal vote ends up getting counted. In relation to fraud, look, the UK has had a couple of cases in the 2000s of local elections where there was some fraud. It was particular ethnic minorities and councillors in small wards, not a few hundred votes made a difference, that led to criminal charges. Outside that, it's never been an issue in Australia, where we often, again, run quite large local elections in many states by post. And it seems to me that the risk of not using postal ballots in a pandemic is many times higher than the risk of using postal ballots. They're much more secure than a hackable internet system, and you don't really have the time anyway to pivot towards an internet system that no one would trust, but the Russians might. And we have these long-established protocols internationally about the double enveloping. In Australia now, we also have a nominated password. It could be something like your favourite dog. And that's another way in which we've achieved extra secrecy and integrity with postal voting. And finally, of course, it's safer than queuing at polling stations. It seems to me that the big question for the US was, will you have an all mail-out election in some states? And do the Republicans think that that's bad because it will increase turnout and will change the rules of the game, if you like, in this particular election? But we have compulsory turnout in Australia, so we don't ever have these arguments about whether it's about voter suppression or appealing to your base. And maybe we could talk later about the joys of compulsory turnout.
Yasmin?
Thanks, Rick. It's great to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation. So in terms of Canada, it's a first past the post system, just like the United States. But one major difference, going back to what you said earlier, Rick, is that there's one set of rules for the entire country. So that's in the Canada Elections Act. And then there's one agency. It's a non-partisan, independent federal agency called Elections Canada that runs the electoral system, administers it. So I think because there's one set of rules and one agency that's in charge, voting by mail is actually a very simple process in Canada. It's not actually used a whole lot. So in 2019, our most recent election, a very tiny percentage, I think like 0.02%, of the voting was done by mail, and this was done from abroad. Most people vote in person. Elections Canada goes through great lengths to make polling places available across the country. It's obviously a challenge given how big the country is. So that's going to change now because of the pandemic. So there may be an election called in Canada this fall, and Elections Canada is already talking about ramping up the mail-in voting and trying to figure out how to manage it. So they've been taking steps already to anticipate that. And they did a poll recently to find out what people were thinking, and as of August 2020, it looks like most people are still planning to go in person, which I found surprising. However, a much larger percentage than before is thinking of using the mail-in vote. So around 22% of those polled said that they would prefer to use the mail-in option. So it's going to be interesting to see how that works. I'm confident that they'll have it up and running if an election is called.
Let me follow up and broaden this a little bit, starting with you, Yasmin. You mentioned Elections Canada. I wanted to look like a little bit of a contrast between who has authority to run elections here in the United States versus in Canada and Australia. So in the United States, I mentioned we have all of these different electoral jurisdictions running elections, but it's even more diffuse than that. So there's some authority that is in the hands of county election boards. There's some authority that's in the hands of the chief election officer of the state, who's typically called the Secretary of State, but not everywhere. There's some authority in the hands of the federal government, and there's authority in the hands of the courts, both the state courts and the federal courts, that sometimes change our rules at the last minute. So just today, we had rulings in both Wisconsin. Today there was a ruling that if your ballot is postmarked in the mail ballot is postmarked by election day, it can arrive up to 6 days later. That was not the rule until today, and that might not be the rule in a few days if an appeals court changes that lower court ruling. We also had a ruling in Nevada. Nevada is one of the 4 states that is going to all mail elections for the first time in this election. Let's see if I can remember. It's Nevada, Vermont, California, and New Hampshire, I believe, that are doing all mail elections on top of the 5 states that normally do that. Those were decisions made by, in some cases, the governor. In California, it was made by the governor. The Republican Party sued to stop every active registered voter from getting a ballot. Then the state legislature came in and ratified the governor's decision. So the argument that it violated state law disappeared. But it's a real diffusion of authority. And on top of this fragmentation of authority, we also see a lot of polarization. A lot of the political parties that are, a lot of the election administrators are members of political parties. So for example, in California, the Secretary of State is campaigning for Joe Biden, which I think, I'd be interested to know if anything like that happens in other countries. We have the Secretary of State of Ohio, who's a Republican, who said that he supported having drop boxes where voters could drop off their mail-in ballots, but then went to court and tried to limit them to 1 per county. And now there's litigation going in the state courts, potentially going to the state Supreme Court over this question. We had the Pennsylvania Supreme Court divide along party lines over whether the Green Party, which is a minor party in the United States, could appear on the ballot in Pennsylvania, which is different than whether it's going to appear on the ballot in another state. So just to give you a sense of so much variety, we have polarization, we have fragmentation, and we also, our Constitution doesn't really guarantee many voting rights, except it prevents discrimination. Once you're going to offer voting, you can't discriminate on the basis of race or gender or something like that. So starting with you, Yasmin, how does this contrast with the Canadian way of running elections? And maybe if you could talk about both national elections as well as more local provincial elections.
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, national elections it's in the hands of Elections Canada. There is some diffusion of authority because the Canada Elections Act is passed by the legislature, by Parliament. And so there is a political angle, but there is a long-standing tradition that election laws, even when they're passed by a government, must be neutral. And in fact, Elections Canada usually has quite a big role in giving feedback and leading, in some instances, the kinds of changes that ought to be made. So there's a real effort on the part of political parties, on the part of politicians, to make sure that Elections Canada remains neutral. We did have one aberration in 2014 in which the government at the time was seen to have made it politicized. And there was actually an uproar across the country. I mean, citizens were demonstrating in the streets against this. It was just seen to be such a egregious departure from the norm of nonpartisanship with respect to elections. So I think that makes a big difference. There's less fighting over the rules because it's seen to be relatively neutral. So for example, with mail-in ballots, I think there really are only two main rules. The first one is that you must apply for your ballot at least a week before the election day. And ballot must be received by 6 p.m. on election day. And I'm not aware of a single case that has been brought on the basis of either of those two rules. It's just sort of a non-issue in terms of electoral administration.
I should say that my colleague Justin Levitt, who has been keeping track of COVID-related election litigation, just posted today on the election law blog, electionlawblog.org, that we've reached 250 cases just that are just COVID-related election cases in the United States. So quite a contrast. Graeme, what is the experience over in Australia?
Well, it's maddening to try and understand the US system from outside, and I've spent research time in the US, although I'm jealous of you because, of course, you have so much more controversies and so much more complexity to deal with, but it must be a heck of a thing to teach students, let alone for us ordinary citizens who move around to understand all this. Australia is ditto to Canada in the sense that we have had a long, long history of neutral election administrations from a single National Electoral Commission for national elections under a single set of nationally set rules by Parliament. And then similarly at state level, they have their own independent electoral commission for each state that runs their elections under their own laws. We tend to have almost the same electoral laws for national and state elections anyway. So all the political parties and system have coalesced around a system at the center of which is this idea of compulsory turnout, which might sound anathema to not just libertarians, but social democrats under your First Amendment. All it means is that if you don't obtain a ballot without a good reason and submit the ballot, you can be hit for a $20 fine, which is less than a parking fee. But what compulsory turnout has meant over the decade is that the parties like it because it saves them costs of getting out the vote. People tend to like it because it leads to less pitching to the extreme bases or suppression of voter turnout. We don't have voter ID laws in Australia. We don't have quite such negative campaigns to try and suppress the other side's turnout to win elections. And what it does is also means that there's an ethos in the system that you have to make voting as easy as possible. You have to have multiple avenues for voting and so on. So even with something like an all-male election, which it potentially could happen in my state of Queensland next month if we had a second wave or first wave of COVID. We haven't even really had a first wave yet. We've only had 6 deaths, mostly from people coming back from overseas with the disease. But if we needed to pivot to a all-male election, all sides of politics has agreed that that will happen, and they've put those measures in place. So something that was once a century ago, our version of the Democratic Party didn't like postal voting too much because it tended to be older, conservative, rural voters, has long since become an accepted alternative, and one which, has started to come back in the last few years with people wanting the convenience of voting either early in person or by post. So we're tending to get 12% of people voting by post anyway, and another 30% voting early, just for convenience, not because it's hard to vote on polling day.
So both of you, have talked about kind of the non-issue of election administration in your countries. And I often hear from people in the United States that we could never have a non-partisan election system because whoever ran it, you could call it non-partisan, but everybody's partisan and they would just manipulate the rules like we see now in order to help the party that they like. Can you each speak, starting with Graeme, about what steps are taken to assure that those who are running elections are insulated from political pressure and are running these elections with the integrity of the system at the top of the list rather than to help one party or the other?
So it's a bit like setting up the Federal Reserve, if that's an analogy. You set up a commission with full statutory independence and control over its budgets. You usually put a retired judge as the notional chair of the organization, and then you have usually a career bureaucrat with knowledge of elections who's appointed with a 5 or 7 year tenure with consultation across the parties. And then you have special rules like no one can be a member of a political party or active in a political party and work for a commission. But it's also a cultural thing. So, you know, when you have a Bill of Rights in the US and judiciaries are so politicized, or you know that a judge was a Republican because once upon a time they registered for a primary as a Republican, that's even a different mind frame. We have a much more formalistic, legalistic judicial system. And, you know, I can see why some people in the US would say, look, we would rather have this crazy paving, hyper-federalized system because it means that, you know, even if the Russians get in, they're only going to be able to tamper with particular areas rather than the whole system. And if you centralize things as we do in Canada and the US and Australia, there is that, I guess, that risk when things go wrong, they go very, very wrong. But so far, in a century and a half, we haven't had the sorts of things go wrong in Australia that you have in the US, because I guess your fear of not central government, then sometimes I always thought there was a fear of government working well in the US, because if government worked well, you would all have to sort of pitch in, and you wouldn't be such a libertarian, individualistic, rights-based society.
Wow, interesting for the Australian to call us too libertarian. Wow, that's
people think we are rough and tumble, but no, I mean, we accept not just compulsory turnout and voting laws, fine for not getting a ballot, but we accept that you have to wear helmets on bicycles or else you will be fined. So we're actually a very utilitarian society, as they say. What works pragmatically works.
So Yasmin, is Canada closer to Australia or the US in its model of election administration?
I think it's closer to Australia. Many of the things Graeme said sounded very familiar from the Canadian perspective. So likewise, the chief electoral officer, who's the person who's in charge of Canada elections, is independent. Is in the position for 10 years. That's seen as giving some protection. It's also the case that in Canada, the enforcement wing is a separate body. So that's the Commissioner of Elections Canada and, Canada Elections. And that person is in a separate government department. There is coordination between the two, but again, to try and make sure that there's absolute neutrality and independence, they've even carved out the enforcement wing as a separate entity. I think there's also, to Graeme's point, it's a cultural thing. So, for example, unlike the United States, in Canada, electoral redistricting is done by independent commissions, right? So that too is seen as being something that should not be politicized and must be done in a similar manner. There's a 3-panel committee, often former judges who are on the committee. There are consultations with various stakeholders, but the idea is that the final answer or final result, whatever it is, must be something that can be acceptable to both sides or all the different political parties.
And what sort of pressure could, say, the Prime Minister bring to bear? If you had a Trumpian leader who wanted to control more levers of power, what kind of protections is there? Or is it just norm-based protection, insulation from political interference?
So that's a great question. I mean, I think the worry for me is that Elections Canada is just a statutory creature, right? And we did in fact see in 2014 with the passage of this so-called Fair Elections Act, there was interference in terms of its mandate. There was a muzzle placed on the chief electoral officer. All kinds of changes were brought in. And it was very worrying actually, because these changes went right to the heart of the independence and neutrality of Elections Canada. I think though, the reaction of the country was just so overwhelming to that. And most of those changes have now been, taken out of the law. I think it became an election issue actually. That government lost dramatically in the subsequent election. And I think part of it was because the election law itself became an election issue. The fact that there was this perception that the neutrality of Elections Canada had been meddled with really did not sit well with the voters. So I think it is norm-based, unfortunately. There isn't a constitutional protection for these rules. So it's, I think, important to keep these norms going to make it seem like, this is how we ought to do things.
Well, it does suggest, at least from the United States experience, that if you like your norms, you might want to put them in the law, because one day someone might come along who doesn't want to follow those norms. And Graeme, in Australia, what insulates the other than that these are people coming, from a long history of being judges or bureaucrats? What insulates them from political pressure there?
So in some states, it would be an act of corruption, and it would go to the Independent Commission Against Corruption if a minister got on the telephone and tried to influence the election authorities. We had a matter 40 odd years ago where the Commonwealth national minister tried to get the name of a seat changed. See, our congressional districts don't have numbers, they have names, a bit like your high schools or post offices. So the names are the good and the great. And he wanted the name to be one name rather than another name. It sounds fairly innocent. There was then a royal commission into that, and he was forced to resign. So largely it is cultural. We don't have a thick constitution like your soaring Bill of Rights, the Eagle. We have a very thin procedural constitution. So some people in the US would say, well, what's going to protect you in the worst case scenario, if Parliament passes egregious laws that just suit the two major parties? Our High Court wouldn't necessarily have the same power that your Supreme Court does. But on the whole, we prefer it that way because the level of trust in the parliaments is relatively higher than, say, in the US. And it means the courts are less politicized on these sort of hot button partisan issues.
So I just want to remind viewers that if you have a question, you can put it in the Q&A box, and we're going to turn to questions in a few minutes, and Victoria is going to be moderating those questions. So type those questions in now. We already have some there. But before we get to that, I want to ask a final question of first Graeme and then Yasmin, which is, since you are students of comparative election law, and you can be maybe a little more dispassionate about what's going on in the United States, what advice would each of you have as you look towards the November election in terms of maybe one or two things that you think the United States really ought to do now in the next 6 weeks as our election is taking place? Does anything come to mind, starting with Graeme?
I think you've got such structural problems that there's nothing I could suggest. If I was to sponsor an Hasen bill, it'd have to be for more long-term reforms, in particular, independent national authority to run elections with a national election law for national elections and state law for state elections. And finding a way to inculcate the habit of voting. Doesn't have to be compulsory turnout laws. Automatic voter registration is something we use in Australia. New Zealand has compulsory registration without compulsory voting as such. But, I know that wouldn't happen in the US. Your Supreme Court might strike it down. But if one party thinks it does better in lower turnout scenarios, or if activists on both sides prefer to campaign to their base, you've got, I think, a long-term problem. And it predates Trump and the issues of COVID and the pandemic. But maybe you could sell it to the parties, because it does save a lot of money in getting out the vote. It does lead to everyone being more considered. And it turns the dial away from negative campaigning. So, I mean, you were in for a very rocky time, and we're rooting for you on the other side of the world, but we also are kind of, can I say, sick of you. I tell my friends, I believe in MAGA. I believe in making America go away. It seems like all these issues flood through the cheap clickbait, hegemonic English language media out of the US and can actually distort debates in other countries, because we're all talking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg rather than our High Court, or we're talking about foibles in US electoral democracy and the Supreme Court that actually don't apply in Australia, for instance. So we would really love you to stabilise democracy, both for your own sake, but also, I think, for debates around the world.
So it's kind of American pollution that we're sending, political pollution that we're sending.
It becomes a lingua franca, but my students will come into the first year public law course knowing more about the US Constitution than the Australian Constitution, and that can be an interesting basis to start from, but it's also a pathology.
Yes, Yasmin.
Well, I think just picking up on one thing that Graeme said, in Canada, likewise, we have very easy voting and very easy registration. So there is a National Register of Voters, and it's updated continuously by, by Elections Canada using, driver's licenses information or tax return information. So it's easy for everyone. I think 96.4% of eligible voters are already registered. And once you're registered forever. That's also true if you're living abroad. So I think just making things a little easier for voters to vote would be one consideration. Also, in terms of identification, in Canada, there's something like 48 different kinds of things you can show, including, for example, a prescription bottle, or if you're living in a homeless shelter, a letter from the person who's running it. So I think making the rules a bit simpler would be helpful. I realize that, you know, that's given the political situation, that's not necessarily easy, but I think that would make a tremendous difference moving forward. The one last thing I would say also is to perhaps, and I think, Rick, you've been doing this quite a bit, and I think it's a good idea, which is to say that there might not be an answer on election day. Given all these complexities, you might not have you know, the final result right away. I mean, depending on how things work out.
Great. All right. Now I think I'm going to turn it back over to Victoria, who's going to be fielding the questions from the audience.
Thank you so much. We do have quite a few questions, and this was fascinating. I'm sort of thinking about wanting to move, maybe. Okay, so the first question I think that we want to look at is one about you all started with the idea that election law in Australia and Canada is for federal elections, there is one law that applies to everyone, one set of rules. And in the US, as Rick said, it's many smaller units that are making their own election rules. What would it take to switch to a single rule base for our federal elections? How could that be possible? Is it constitutional amendment, et cetera? Would that even be possible in the US?
I guess that's a question to me. The Constitution of the United States contains a provision in Article 1, Section 4, which says that the states get to set the rules for congressional elections, but subject to override by Congress. And so this is the power that Congress has used, for example, when it passed the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, which requires every time you go to the DMV or to a public assistance office that you're offered a voter registration opportunity. So I think politically, if we want to do some of the things that Yasmin and Graeme had suggested, that we would be able to have, I don't know about compulsory voting, because I think that might raise First Amendment concerns, although I agree with Graeme, they're probably surmountable if you could cast a blank ballot, for example. But national voter registration, national voter ID, a National Election Commission, maybe. But I think a lot of this could be accomplished by federal statute. The real barrier is political in the United States. The real barrier is that, as Graeme said, one political party sees it in its interest to make it have a smaller electorate, and the other to expand the electorate. It's kind of like the flip side of the argument I've heard about trying to make an end run around the Electoral College by having states form a compact to pledge their vote winners to the national popular vote. I mean, something very complex, but something that somebody could pull out of anytime. You could have California allowing 14-year-olds to vote. It's hard to come up with solutions short of amending our Constitution, which is very difficult to do. It takes supermajority of states and Congress to agree. So we could try a statute. If there were the political will to do it. Some of the things would probably have to involve a constitutional amendment. And we haven't seen a successful constitutional amendment in many decades in the United States.
Okay, difficult, but not impossible. So I had another question here from, if there is a problem with fraud, or there's some reason that people think the election wasn't fair, is there any system of do-over in any of our systems? Could an election be challenged and some way rerun an election because of serious concerns about how the election was run or the outcome or something like that?
One, you want to take that from, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I can just give one example from Canada. We actually had a situation like that where there was a dispute. What happened in that case is the Supreme Court said that just little irregularities aren't enough to do it again, like to throw out the election results. It's got to be something pretty serious. It's got to be the kind of irregularity that really poses a tremendous challenge to the integrity of the vote. So we have some idea of where the line is in Canada. Small mistakes are not going to, small administrative errors are not going to be enough to result in a new election, but it would have to be very major errors in order for something like that to happen.
I can speak to the United States and say that I would say it's also a very high bar to get a new election. We did see a new election ordered in 2018. There was a congressional race in North Carolina for North Carolina's 9th congressional district. And what happened there was tampering with absentee ballots. A Republican candidate had hired a political operative who went in and allegedly destroyed some ballots or voted some blank ballots. And the election board in North Carolina, on a bipartisan basis, said we needed to have a new election. They did a do-over. The problem in the United States with the presidential election is that it'd be very difficult to have a do-over for the presidential election. The Constitution provides a single election day. And this is a problem not only of fraud. So one of the things I write about in my book, Election Meltdown, is what if we had a Russian cyber attack on the power grid in a city that affected, say, the vote in Michigan? Would a court order a revote in Michigan only after the rest of the states have voted? And these are questions that are open questions, and lots of states don't have statutes or plans in place in case there's a disruption. Some states like Florida do for hurricanes and things like that. So it's not just fraud, it could be a natural disaster or some kind of attack that could disrupt our elections. And I think more of our states need to have procedures in place to deal with those kinds of emergencies.
Graeme, what happens in Australia? Any do-overs?
Do-overs. Yeah, it's possible to have a fresh election ordered if the election is undue. I lived in 2005 through a situation where the Labor Party, the Social Democratic Party in my state, was in a hung parliament territory, and there was a do-over in one very narrow, marginal, crucial seat or district, and a judge took a quite strict view of the law and said because certain postal ballots had not been delivered by a private contractor in time to troops overseas, there had to be a fresh election in that crucial seat. And the Labor government stayed in power until there was the do-over, as you call it, and they actually lost that seat. So there were questions, as Rick said, about what you might call asynchronous rights. If one group of people then get to vote and decide who is the government, that's problematic. And that's obviously an even bigger issue if you're talking about the presidential election, which is meant to be a single election, and you've got to have a new guy or woman sworn in by January, don't you?
Well, if we don't, then we have an order of succession in the 20th Amendment of the Constitution. It says if no president is chosen by January 20th, then we go to the order of succession. So we could have President Nancy Pelosi as one possibility, or President Chuck Grassley. So all kinds of strange possibilities under our system. I'm sure your students will come into class and tell you all about it.
All right, well, this kind of leads into another question, which is about election day. It seems as though there's an election day in all three of these systems, and yet election day is now a week, 10 days for votes to be collected. What are the pros and cons of actually having a single election day where everybody shows up and is required to vote on one day?
Well, I think the biggest con of that is that our system in the United States is not equipped to handle the volume. I guess the pro is everyone's voting at the same time, so it goes to that point of simultaneity that Graeme mentioned. But the downsides are way too big. You know, we have had situations of long lines, people waiting 4 or 8 hours or even longer to vote. And that can be disenfranchising because not everybody can wait that long. Not everybody's physically able. People have to work. People have childcare responsibilities. And so I think some means of early voting is really important. So we take Texas, for example. There's been a lot of litigation over whether people can vote by mail during the pandemic. And Texas has taken a hard line that they cannot. They're one of 6 states in the United States that say you must have a valid excuse unless you're at least 65. They have, I think, 3 weeks of early voting in person. So you have other opportunities. And one of the advantages of early voting is if there's a long line, you could come back another time. So you have a more voter convenience. I think that convenience and the flattening of the demand on election day is really important for a system like the United States, where it creates a lot of difficulty having everyone voting at the polling place on election day.
The other con with not having a singular election day, and I've written a book about this, is the loss of the physical public ritual where you can see the society coming out together on that day. And it's obviously not particularly important in a time of a pandemic. And I should say, when I used the word convenience voting earlier, we don't have the problems that Rick mentioned in Australia. We vote on Saturdays. We've always voted on Saturdays, not on a weekday. That allows us to vote at community schools and so on. We have sausage sizzles set up at polling stations. But over time, people are preferring to vote early because most people are staunch voters. They know which party they want to vote ahead of time. I am interested, though, in the US, you have so many races going on at once. You've got the so-called long ballot. I'm wondering how you can fit all that paper into all the mail-in and application envelopes, and what that leads to the logistical problems of doing all this counting physically without your voting machines.
Well, almost all of the mail ballots are optical scan ballots. That is, people will bubble in with a pen or a pencil their choices, and then they'll be fed into machines that will read those votes. You're right, unlike, it's a very significant difference that we didn't mention. Unlike national elections in Australia or Canada, we combine our local elections into a very long ballot. I think in California, you could be voting on 70 or more items when you take into account federal races, state races, local races, and ballot propositions. And so that also increases lines at the polls, and is yet another reason to have early voting or voting by mail, where people have more convenience. One of the things that they've done in Los Angeles County, they've just adopted new voting machines where you can pre-program your votes on your smartphone. It will create a QR code. You can then scan the QR code and it will print out a ballot with your choices, which you can then confirm before you drop it into the ballot deposit box. So very fancy, still produces a piece of paper, but helps with some of the lines because of all of the number of races you need to vote upon.
So let me follow up with this. There is some question about what would happen. What is the voting day? Like we have a voting day, and it's not convenient for everybody. It's hard to get time off work, off school, etc. What could be done about the voting day, and more philosophically, what's an ideal voting day? What should we do to make sure that everybody gets a chance to have a vote that's counted in terms of making voting accessible in time?
Well, again, in the United States, most places offer some means of early voting. And if you have an excuse, like you have a disability that would prevent you from getting to the polls, you can vote by mail. So I think we should be thinking about it as an election period. And one of the things the Supreme Court said in a case in the 1990s is voting has to take place by election day, but it could be before election day. So election day is kind of the last day for the casting of the ballot. Although in a number of states, there are runoffs that take place in December. One of the things we're going to see is even if we have a definitive winner a few days after election day in the United States for president, there may be some Senate races that are going to go to a runoff in places like Georgia, where we may not know. And this could be quite significant in terms of replacing Justice Ginsburg and when that vote might take place. One of the elections that's taking place for the United States Senate, even though it's taking place on election day, is actually a special election to fill John McCain's seat for the rest of his term. Martha McSally was appointed to that term, but there's 2 more years left. And so now if Mark Kelly beats McSally, Mark Kelly is the Democrat, he might be seated as early as November 30th, which could change the composition of the court, of the Senate, which could affect who gets put on the Supreme Court. So, you know, we have a number of octogenarians who are senators. Will they all be able to vote in the midst of the pandemic? So we have, you know, there's a lot of serendipity, just like you know, we've seen over the last few months. You don't know what the next twist and turn is going to be here in the United States in terms of our political system.
So just to give the Canadian experience on your question, the way it works here is you get what's called a voter information card. It usually comes about a month before the election. And on the card, it gives your information. And then on the back, it tells you where you should go for the advance polls. It's often at a different place, and all the dates which are available. And then it also gives you information on election day. So many people vote in the advance polls, I think about a quarter, maybe more. So when on election day itself, I know when I've gone, it takes 2 minutes. There's no line. I just walk in, vote, walk right out. Because I think they try and have several days in advance, which are available. It's always the same days. There's always a weekend. There's always, you know, during the week, and usually all day long as well. So to make it easy for people, I think that might be, you know, one difference is that the point is to make it as easy as possible in all kinds of ways. And I think that's one difference I see as between the 2 countries.
I think this one is for Rick. It's because it's a question about states. Is it possible for a state to decide not to use winner take all and instead to do proportionate votes based on the overall popular vote in their state?
You're talking about for president?
Uh-huh.
So just for anyone who's listening internationally who might not be familiar with this, we vote state by state, and each state is assigned a certain number of votes for the Electoral College based on the number of senators and representatives that they have. And in most states in the United States, it's winner take all. So if somebody barely wins, it doesn't have to be a majority, it could be a plurality. You know, someone could get 42% of the vote and they could get all of California's Electoral College votes. There are a few states, 2 states, Nebraska and Maine, that divide their votes and have some of the seats by congressional district. So that's permissible. You could also do proportionally. I don't think California would want to adopt that unilaterally, because then you know, it would dilute the votes of California. California tends to vote very heavily Democratic, and it would send a lot of Republican electors to the Electoral College. Same thing with Texas. If Texas is Republican, but 40-something% vote for Democrats, it would divide it up. But the Constitution in Article 2 says that each state legislature gets to set the manner for choosing presidential elections. And maybe I'll end with this point, which probably be a shock to a lot of people listening. The Supreme Court in 2000 in Bush versus Gore, which was the case that ended that disputed election, said that although the state legislatures have given the power of voters to vote directly for president, the state legislatures can take back that power at any time. So now, maybe they can't take it back now once voting has started for this election. But, you know, the state legislature in theory could say, you know, no more voting in California for president. The state legislature is going to decide that itself. I think there would be rioting in the streets. I think people would be quite upset to know that they don't have a right to vote for president, but the Constitution doesn't grant them that. And that's one of the things I meant when I said earlier that the United States Constitution offers very weak protection for voting rights. Part of that is the United States Constitution is pretty old, and it was written before there were political parties. It was written before we had this one person, one vote ideal, and so it doesn't really reflect necessarily current thinking about voting rights.
And as you said earlier, perhaps it's a good idea to enshrine certain things in law if you value them.
Yes.
I want to thank all of you for being with us today. This has been fascinating, maybe terrifying, maybe hopeful for some of us. Certainly really, really interesting to know what are other systems and how they work, and how citizens feel about their options in countries outside of the United States when the US is in a really time of conflict and doubt about the system itself. So thank you very much for sharing with us. Professor Hasen, Professor Dawood, Professor Orr, you've been fabulous. To everybody who's watching, thank you for the questions. We will put this recording, we'll make it available for those, if you want to share or refer back to it at some time, on our website, uci.edu/global. And I would just encourage everyone, please go out and vote. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.